The cart track ended in a drift of grey-white snow. No ruts, no wheel marks, only the faint depression where something very heavy had passed weeks ago, now filled with frost crystals that caught the pale morning light like scattered salt. Above, a sky the color of old pewter held its breath. No wind. No birdsong. Just the faint creak of timber somewhere ahead, a sound like a house settling in its sleep. You could still read the road's memory in the landscape. It had once been wide enough for 2 carts to pass, the old imperial trace, they called it, though no one living remembered the empire. The road had been carved into frozen earth, its surface studded with flat stones that had worked loose over generations of use, scattering into the fields like spilled teeth. Now those fields were buried. The hedgerows, skeletal hawthorn and bare-branch sloe, stood as low walls of shadow against the snow. Everything had the quality of a faded ink drawing, present, legible, but drained of color. The last farmstead sat 3 hours behind him. The farmer had stood in his doorway when Ewan left, arms folded, watching. He hadn't offered food. He hadn't offered warning. He had simply watched, the way a man watches a dog that has no choice but to follow the road it has been given. Ewan's boots left a clean, deep print in the unblemished snow. Behind him, nothing. No other tracks. No evidence that anyone had come this way in weeks. The road ahead climbed a low ridge, and beyond that ridge there was supposed to be a watchtower. Everyone in the village called it the end of the road tower. They said it with a particular tone, not quite contempt, not quite fear. Something between those two feelings, the way a person might speak of a scar they had chosen to ignore. He pulled his coat tighter and kept walking. What the farmer had not said, what no one in the village had said plainly, was that the previous watchman had not been replaced. There had been one before, a man named Coren, who had served at the tower for 11 winters. Coren had sent word to the village twice each year, once at the autumn equinox, once at the spring thaw, both times with a single sentence written in the careful hand of someone who had learned letters late in life. Asterisk all is quiet. No movement on the road. Asterisk that was all. That was enough. But this past autumn, no letter had come. Ewan climbed the ridge. The snow resisted his weight with the particular crunch of very cold ice, a sound that was less like walking and more like something very small and fragile being crushed underfoot. He thought about Coren often. They had not been friends, exactly, but they had shared a kind of understanding. Both men who preferred the company of weather to the company of people. Both men who had learned, in their different ways, that silence was not an absence but a presence with its own weight and texture. At the top of the ridge, he stopped. The tower stood at the end of the road. It was smaller than he had imagined. Stone, 3 stories high, its uppermost section slightly broader than the body of the tower, the watch chamber, where the keeper would spend long hours scanning the road and the fields and the dark line of forest that marked the northern boundary of the known world. A wooden gallery ran around the top, though half of it had collapsed inward, eaten by seasons and neglect. Smoke rose from the tower's single chimney, thin, barely visible, the color of wet wool. Someone was inside. Or something was still burning from the last time someone had been inside. The road did not stop at the tower. It continued past it, narrowing, its stones barely visible above the snow, heading north toward the forest and whatever lay beyond. Ewan had been told, in the careful terms village leaders used when they wanted to say something without appearing to say it, that the road beyond the tower was not maintained. That no one was required to patrol it. That the tower existed, primarily, as a signal point, a place from which fire could be lit, if needed, to warn the village of movement from the north. No one had ever explained what kind of movement. No one had ever described what they were afraid of. The absence of detail made the fear more effective, not less. It was the same technique used by the old stories: give a child a dark room and let their imagination supply the monster. Ewan walked the last 100 paces to the tower door. It was made of oak, iron-banded, its surface scarred with old axe marks that no one had bothered to interpret. A rusted ring hung where a handle should have been. He lifted the ring and let it fall against the wood. The sound was enormous in the silence, a deep, bronze resonance that seemed to push the snow back from the door, as if the sound itself occupied physical space. He waited. No one answered. Our winter walk begins quietly at the ridge. Pull your chair close to whatever warmth you have found tonight. The fire, the blanket, the low hum of a life that has not required you to climb a ridge in 10 degrees of cold. You have chosen well. You are here, at the end of the road, and I have been waiting for someone to walk it with me. I am the DrowZy historian, and I collect the places that have forgotten themselves. The garrison towns that fell silent. The winter roads that no longer lead anywhere a person wants to go. The towers that stand at boundaries for no reason anyone can still justify. I walk into these places slowly, with attention, and I try to understand what the silence is saying. Tonight, we are at the end of the road tower. The locals call it that because no one has ever given it a better name, and because the name itself tells you everything you need to know. You have come as far as the road will take you. What happens next is no longer the road's concern. I will speak to you in the old way, in the tone that does not demand you look up, does not ask you to remember what you were doing before this moment. You may feel your eyes grow heavy. You may feel the pull of sleep at the edges of your attention. This is not a failure of focus. This is the point. We are here to rest inside a story, not to conquer it. We can go inside quietly and see what Corin left behind. The door opened with the sound of cold hinges, iron that had contracted in the frost and now protested every degree of movement. Ewan pushed hard against it, felt the resistance give way, and stepped inside. The ground floor was a single room. Stone walls, bare except for a coat hook near the door, an old coat, still hanging, its wool dark with years of use, and a shelf on which someone had placed 3 ceramic bowls, stacked neatly, their surfaces covered in a fine layer of dust. A wooden table stood against the far wall. On the table, a candle, burned down to a thick waxy stump, a knife with a bone handle, and a piece of slate, its surface covered in chalk marks, tally marks, perhaps, or some private notation system, grouped in sets of 5, running the full length of the slate's surface. Ewan counted them. There were more than 800 marks. The cold here was different from the cold outside. It was a dense, mineral cold, the cold of stone that has been holding winter in its walls for months. His breath appeared immediately, a small cloud that dispersed before it reached his chest. He could smell something, not smoke exactly, but the memory of smoke, the way a room retains the ghost of every fire that has been burned inside it. Against one wall, a ladder rose through a square hole in the ceiling. The ladder was solid oak, its rungs worn smooth by years of hands and boots. Ewan placed his foot on the first rung and felt it hold. He began to climb. The second floor was a sleeping quarters, a narrow stone platform built into the wall, just wide enough for a single body, covered with a straw mattress that had been rolled and tied with cord. Beside the platform, a small wooden chest, its lid secured with a simple latch. Above the sleeping platform, a window no larger than a man's head, its stone frame worn smooth inside from the passage of countless eyes looking out. Ewan paused at the window. Through it, he could see the road he had walked, the ridge he had climbed, and beyond that, the village, now invisible behind the rise of land. He was already further from the world than he had intended to be. On the floor beside the mattress, a pair of boots. Well made, leather, the soles worn thin. They were not large boots. Ewan looked at them for a long time. Then he placed his own boots beside them and stood in Corin's boots. They were close to his size. He would keep them. Corin would not be needing them. The chest was locked, but the latch was old and the wood around it had split slightly with the cold. Ewan worked his knife into the gap and pried the lid open. Inside, a change of clothing, wool, well-worn, the cloth soft from years of washing, a small wooden box containing needles and thread and a button made of bone, a leather pouch that held a mixture of dried herbs. He could identify mint and something bitter, possibly sage, possibly something he did not know, and a small book. The book was not a book in any formal sense. It was a collection of pages, perhaps 30, bound together with thread that had been knotted and re-knotted many times over. The pages were covered in handwriting, small and cramped, filling every available space on every side of every leaf. Ewan did not read it immediately. He set it aside and continued to climb. The third floor, the watch chamber, was the top of the tower, open on 3 sides to the wind. A wooden gallery had once surrounded the central space, but the northern side had collapsed entirely, its planks scattered on the frozen ground far below, invisible from where Ewan stood. The watch chamber itself was circular, its walls made of stone and mortar, with arrow slits on every side. In the center, a fire pit, a ring of flat stone surrounding a bed of old ash. The ash was grey and cold and undisturbed. No one had lit a fire here in weeks. But there was wood stacked against the wall. Dry wood, split and stacked with the care of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation. Enough wood, Ewan calculated, for perhaps 3 weeks of regular fires. Not enough for the full winter, but enough to get him through the worst of it, if he was careful. He walked to the eastern arrow slit and looked out. The road continued north, visible as a pale line in the white landscape, curving gently toward the dark line of forest. He could see the forest clearly now, a wall of black and grey and brown, the trees stripped bare by autumn and standing in their winter silence. Beyond the forest, nothing. No hills, no mountains, no second line of trees. Just the suggestion of a horizon that continued forever, flat and white and featureless. He thought about the marks on the slate. 800 and more. Someone had been counting days. Someone had been here, alone, marking off each morning and each night, watching the road, watching the forest, waiting for something that had never come. Or something that had come and left no record. Ewan stepped back from the arrow slit. The wind found him immediately, a thin, sharp wind from the north, carrying the smell of snow and iron and something else, something he could not identify. Not rot. Not smoke. Something older. The smell of a place that has been cold for so long that it has become, itself, a kind of temperature. He descended the ladder. He closed the door behind him. He placed his pack in the corner and made his bed on the straw mattress in the sleeping quarters on the 2nd floor. The cold was profound. But he had known cold before. He slept. He woke before dawn. The quality of the light told him this, a pale grey filtering through the narrow window, not yet the blue-grey of true night but not the warm grey of morning either. The hour when the world is deciding what it wants to be. The fire had gone out entirely. The tower held cold in its walls the way a well holds water, deep and still and patient. Ewan lay still for several minutes, feeling the cold settle against his body like a second skin. Then he rose, dressed in the clothes he had brought. Corran's clothes would need to air and warm before he wore them. He knew this instinctively, the way you know not to put on cold leather, and climbed to the watch chamber. He laid a fire. He was methodical about it. Old wood first, kindling drawn from the base of the stack, where the wood was driest, then larger pieces arranged in the way he had been taught by a man whose name he had forgotten years ago, in a village that no longer existed on any map he had seen. He struck flint against steel, caught the sparks in a twist of birch bark, nursed the ember with breath that hurt his throat. The smoke rose in a thin column that leaned hard to the north, pulled by the wind that never seemed to stop entirely, even in the stillest weather. The fire caught. The watch chamber filled with warmth, not enough warmth to be comfortable, not by any normal measure, but enough to make the cold bearable. Enough to remind his hands that they could still feel things other than numbness. He stood at the eastern arrow slit and watched the sun rise. It was a slow sunrise. The sky lightened in stages, pewter to silver to the faintest hint of copper at the horizon's edge, where the sun pushed through a layer of cloud and painted the snow in shades of amber and rose that lasted perhaps 20 minutes before dissolving into the flat grey of a winter morning. Ewan had seen sunrises from high places before. This one was not remarkable. But it was the first sunrise of his watch, the first of what he understood would be hundreds of similar mornings, each one indistinguishable from the last except for the small variations in color and cloud that the sky chose to offer. He descended to the ground floor. He ate hard bread that he had brought, dense and sour, the kind of bread that keeps for months when kept dry, and a portion of dried meat that was more tendon than muscle but provided the protein his body needed. He drank water from a clay jug that stood beside the table. The water tasted of stone. It was cold enough to hurt his teeth. He did not light the signal fire. There was nothing to signal, and the wood would be needed for warmth, not for communication. The tower's purpose, if it still had one, was not to send messages but to be present. To stand at the end of the road and remind whatever might be watching that someone was here. That someone was still watching. He returned to the watch chamber and began his first day of observation. The hours passed slowly. He watched the road. He watched the fields. He watched the forest. He watched the sky, looking for the signs of weather that the farmers in the village had taught him to read, the way clouds stacked themselves against the northern horizon, the direction and quality of the wind, the behavior of birds. There were very few birds, he had seen perhaps a dozen since his arrival, all of them small and dark and moving with the urgent purposefulness of creatures that had no time to waste on a cold world. He made notes on a fresh piece of slate he had found in the chest on the second floor. The notes were simple: time, weather, direction of wind, estimated visibility in leagues, a unit of measurement he had learned from an old soldier who had served on the northern marches, though that soldier had been dead for years and Ewan could no longer remember his face. He noted the absence of tracks on the road. He noted the presence of smoke from the village, visible as a thin pale line against the southern sky. He noted the silence. The silence was the most difficult thing to record. It resisted notation. It was not the silence of an empty room, which has a texture and a temperature. It was the silence of a world that had chosen not to speak, not from inability, but from some deep and ancient decision that sound was no longer necessary, that the conversation had ended long ago and had not been resumed. At midday, he heard the bell. It came from below, a single, clear note, not loud but resonant, climbing the stone walls of the tower like something alive. Ewan went to the head of the ladder and looked down. The ground floor was empty. The door was closed. There was no one there. He descended and examined the room. The coat hook was bare, his own coat now hung there, heavy with the memory of his body. The bowls were still stacked on the shelf. The knife still lay on the table beside the slate of tallies. He looked for the source of the sound and found nothing. Then he looked at the ceiling, the underside of the ladder platform, and saw it. A small iron bell hung from a wooden peg driven into a beam. It was no larger than a child's fist, its surface darkened with age, its clapper covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like fur. Ewan reached up and touched it. The moment his finger made contact, the bell rang again, a single note that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that was not loud but that filled the tower completely, pushing into every corner and every crack, settling into the stone. He let go. The sound faded. The silence returned. He climbed back to the watch chamber and continued his observation. He did not write about the bell in his notes. Some things did not need to be written down. Some things needed only to be heard. By the third day, Ewan had established a routine. He woke before dawn. He lit the fire. He watched the road. He descended for meals at regular intervals, twice in the day, once at evening, and each time he passed the iron bell on the ground floor and each time it remained silent, as if the sound he had heard on his first morning had been a dream or a trick of the cold or the first note of a conversation he had not yet learned to join. On the third evening, he read Corin's journal. He sat at the table on the ground floor, a candle burning beside him, and opened the bundle of pages. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, written in a hand that had learned letters as an adult, each stroke deliberate, each word formed with the concentration of someone who understood that words were not free, that every page consumed was a page that could not be replaced. Ewan recognized this kind of writing. He had seen it in the records of other frontier posts, in the letters that soldiers wrote home from the edges of the known world. The journal began simply. Day 1. Arrived at the tower. The road ends here. The view north is unobstructed. I will watch. Day 12. First frost. The watch chamber holds cold even with fire. The wood supply is adequate. No movement on the road. Day 23. The bell rang today. I did not touch it. I was on the second floor when it sounded, one clear note, then silence. I searched the room and found nothing. I do not know what caused it. Ewan paused. He looked at the bell. He looked at the journal entry. He turned back to the pages. Day 31. The bell rang again. This time I was in the watch chamber. The sound came from below, from the ground floor. I descended and found nothing disturbed. I touched the bell and it rang at my touch, but the first sound was not caused by me. I do not understand this. He read on. Day after day, season after season, year after year. Corin's journal recorded the slow passage of time at the end of the road tower with the methodical patience of a man counting heartbeats. The entries grew longer as the years passed, not because Corin had more to say, but because he had learned to fill the silence with observation, to notice the small changes in weather and light and sound that a less attentive keeper would have missed. Day 847. Snow. Deep snow. The road is invisible beneath it. I cannot tell where the road ends and the field begins. I remain in the watch chamber and watch the white nothing. The bell has not rung in many days. Asterisk day 1103. Spring. The snow has retreated to the forest's edge. The road is visible again. I walked it today as far as the ridge. From the ridge I could see the village. No smoke from the chimney of the inn. Perhaps they are busy. Perhaps they have forgotten to tend their fire. I will signal if the smoke does not return by the equinox. Asterisk. The equinox came and went. Koren noted that the village smoke returned. He noted that the road remained empty. He noted the arrival of autumn and the first frost and the first snow of his second winter. The journal entries continued, season after season, year after year, and Ewan read them with the slow and increasing fascination of a man who is beginning to understand that he is not reading about a place but about a life, a complete and self-contained life lived in a single tower at the end of a road that led nowhere anyone wanted to go. He found the entries from the final months. Day 4018. I am tired. The kind of tired that sleep does not cure. I have watched the road for 11 years. I have counted 4018 days. I have seen nothing. No movement, no sound, no change. The road holds its emptiness like a man holds his breath. I wonder if there is anything left to watch for, or if I have been sent here to guard an absence. Day 4031. The bell rang again. This time I was in the watch chamber and I heard it clearly, a sound like a question, a single note that rose and rose again before falling silent. I went to the ground floor and found nothing. But on the table beside the tally slate, there was a mark that I do not remember making. A symbol. I do not know what it means. Ewan looked at the table. The slate was still there, still covered in tally marks. Beside it, the knife with the bone handle. He looked for a mark, a symbol, anything that might correspond to what Koren had described. The surface of the table was worn smooth by years of use, marked with rings from cups and the ghost shapes of objects that had been placed and moved and placed again. There was nothing he could identify as a symbol. But he had not been looking for 11 years. He had been looking for 5 minutes. He read on. Day 4032. I did not sleep well. The cold was severe, more severe than I have known. The fire in the watch chamber burned low despite my attention. I dreamed of the road. In the dream, the road was not empty. There were figures on it, distant, indistinct, moving slowly north. I could not tell if they were men or women or children. I could not tell if they were real or memory. When I woke, my hands were cold and my breath was visible in the dark and the bell was silent. Day 4033. I have decided to walk the road beyond the tower. I have never done this. The road continues north, past the tower, into the forest. I have been told not to walk it. I have been told that the road beyond belongs to no one's jurisdiction and that no keeper is required to patrol it. But I have watched it for 11 years, and I believe it is time to learn what lies at its end. I will leave tomorrow, if the weather permits. I will leave the bell untended for the first time since my arrival. I do not know what will happen. That was the last entry. Ewan read it twice. Then he closed the journal and sat in the silence of the ground floor, listening to the wind move through the tower, feeling the cold press against the walls, and understanding, with a clarity that was itself a kind of cold, that Koren had walked the road and had not returned. Day 4034. I am on the road. The snow is deep but firm, the kind of snow that holds weight if you move carefully. The forest is closer than it appeared from the tower. The trees are all leafless, their branches like the lines of an old map, all converging at the same point above me. There is no sound. I have been walking for 2 hours and I have not seen a single animal, not heard a single bird, not felt the wind against my face. The air is still. It is the stillest place I have ever been. Ewan did not walk the road that day. He was not ready. He was not sure he would ever be ready, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes from sitting in a cold stone tower at the end of a road that leads nowhere, that readiness might not be the point. He read more of the journal. He read the entries from the first winter, Corin's descriptions of the cold, of the way ice formed on the inside of the arrow slits and did not melt until spring, of the way the straw mattress became so cold at night that it felt like sleeping on stone, of the way his breath froze on the inside of his wool shirt and he woke each morning with a garment stiff and cold against his skin. He read about the sound of the wind in the watch chamber, a sound like a voice speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension, a sound that Corin had learned to ignore but never to forget. He read about the loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, Corin had chosen this life, or had accepted it, which was in some ways the same thing. But the deeper loneliness of witnessing. The loneliness of watching something that no one else could see, of standing at a window and looking at a landscape that existed for no one but yourself, of recording observations that would be read by no one and that referred to a world that no one else had any interest in understanding. Day 2847. I saw the lights last night. In the forest. 3 lights, low to the ground, the color of a candle seen through glass. They did not move. They did not flicker. They simply stood in the trees like eyes that had forgotten how to blink. I watched them for an hour. Then, one by one, they went out. I do not know what they were. I do not know if they were real. I have written this in the journal because the journal is the only place I have, and because something must be recorded even if it cannot be understood. Ewan closed the journal. He sat in the cold and thought about lights in a forest at night. He thought about a man alone in a tower, watching lights that no one else could see, recording them in a book that no one else would read. He thought about the 4,033 days that Corin had spent here, and the moment when he had finally decided to walk the road beyond the tower, and the silence that had followed. On the 5th morning, Ewan climbed to the watch chamber and looked at the road. The road was empty. It had been empty every morning since his arrival. He understood that it would be empty tomorrow and the morning after and every morning for as long as he chose to watch it. The road did not lead anywhere that mattered. The people of the village used the road to reach the market town to the south, a journey of 2 days on foot, well within the boundaries of the known and the civilized. No one went north. No one had gone north in living memory, except Corin, who had gone once, on the 4,034th day of his watch, and had not returned. Ewan lit the fire. He watched the road. He made his notes. He thought about the bell. In the afternoon, he descended to the ground floor and stood before the bell. It hung from its peg in the beam, silent, patient, its surface furred with dust. He reached up and touched it with one finger. It made no sound. He pressed harder. The clapper moved against the inside of the bell and a faint note emerged, thin, barely audible, more vibration than sound. He let go. The note faded. The silence returned. He did not understand the bell. He suspected that understanding it was not the point. Some objects in some places did not need to be understood. They needed only to be present, to do their work in the world without requiring acknowledgement or explanation. The bell was here. The bell rang sometimes, for reasons that Koren had never determined and that Yuan could not guess. The bell would ring again, when it chose, and someone, perhaps not Yuan, perhaps not anyone, would hear it and wonder. Yuan learned quickly that fire was the difference between life and death in the end of the road tower. The watch chamber held cold the way a jar holds darkness, completely, without compromise. The stone walls drew heat from the air and held it in their surface and released it slowly, so slowly that even a roaring fire would cool within an hour of being allowed to burn low. He learned to feed the fire in small, constant additions, not enough to create great heat, but enough to maintain a steady temperature, a line of warmth that his body could learn to anticipate and rely upon. He learned to read the wood. The best wood came from the bottom of the stack, the pieces that had been there longest, that had lost their moisture to the dry cold and burned with a clean, bright flame. The top layers were covered in frost and ice, and when burned, they created steam and smoke and a fire that hissed and spat and gave off very little heat. He rotated the wood daily, bringing the dry bottom pieces to the top, allowing the frozen top pieces to rest near the fire where they could slowly thaw and dry. He learned to bank the fire at night, a technique he had been taught by an old forester in the southern villages, a man who had spent his life in winter camps and understood that a fire banked correctly could hold a bed of coals for 8 hours or more, requiring only a few minutes of attention in the morning to coax it back to life. He used ash and ember and a careful arrangement of half-burned logs to create an environment in which the fire could survive without him, sustaining itself at a level just above extinction, giving off enough heat to keep the worst of the cold at bay. This was the knowledge that kept him alive. Not courage, not vigilance, not the qualities that were valued in the official descriptions of a watchman's duty. Just fire. Just the careful, patient maintenance of heat in a cold stone room at the top of a tower at the end of a road where no one would come to help him if the fire went out. By the second week, Yuan had stopped recording everything in his notes. He had stopped because the act of writing had begun to feel like a betrayal of what he was actually experiencing. The notes were accurate: time, weather, temperature, wind direction, the state of the road, the condition of the wood supply, but they captured nothing of the quality of the time he spent in the watch chamber. They were like a portrait painted in numbers, technically correct, aesthetically meaningless. So he stopped writing, and he began instead to simply watch. He watched the snow. He watched the way it changed texture over the course of a day, harder in the morning when the sun was low and the frost was deepest, softer in the afternoon when the weak winter sun drew enough warmth to begin the slow process of melting and refreezing. He watched the tracks that appeared and disappeared around the tower, the tracks of animals, mostly, though he could not identify them all. There were the long, low tracks of something that moved in pairs, probably foxes, though the tracks were too large for the foxes he knew from the southern villages. There were the deep, splayed prints of something heavier, a wolf, perhaps, or a large dog of the kind that roaming farmers kept to guard their flocks. There were smaller tracks too, quick and erratic, the tracks of birds that had come down from the trees to forage in the snow. And there were other tracks. Tracks that appeared on no schedule, that seemed to come from nowhere and lead nowhere, that followed the line of the road north and then stopped, mid-stride, as if the creature that had made them had simply ceased to exist at the moment of crossing some invisible threshold. Yuan watched these tracks without touching them. He did not walk to them. He did not examine them closely. He watched them from the watch chamber with the particular attention of a man who knows that some doors, once opened, do not close again. On the 9th night, the cold returned. It came without warning, a drop in temperature so sudden and so severe that Ewan woke with the sensation that his face was covered in ice. He lay still, breathing through his mouth, and felt the cold press against his body with an almost physical weight. The straw mattress had become rigid. His breath was visible in the dark, hanging in the air like smoke that would not disperse. He rose and climbed to the watch chamber. The fire was banked, as always, but the banked fire was failing. The coals were dim, their warmth barely perceptible, and the cold was pushing in from every side, through the arrow slits, through the gaps in the wooden gallery, through the stone itself, which had been absorbing the outside cold for hours and was now releasing it inward like a second skin of winter. He rebuilt the fire. He fed it with the best wood, dry, crackling, the wood that burned with a sound like a whisper, and he sat beside it and held his hands near the flame and watched the light move across the stone walls of the watch chamber. The cold was still there. It would always be there. But the fire held it back, pushed it to the edges of the room, created a small circle of warmth in which a man could survive. He thought about Corinne. He thought about the entries in the journal describing nights like this, nights so cold that the ink in the inkwell froze, that the pages of the book became brittle and tore if handled carelessly, that the water in the clay jug turned to ice and expanded and cracked the jug's surface, so that the water leaked slowly onto the floor over a period of hours, creating a slow, spreading damp that no one discovered until spring. He thought about what it meant to endure, not as a feat of will or strength, but as a daily practice of small decisions, to rise from a cold bed, to climb a ladder, to feed a fire, to watch a road, to eat hard bread, to make notes on a slate, to wait. The endurance was not dramatic. It was not heroic in any way that the word was commonly used. It was simply the accumulation of ordinary actions performed across an ordinary span of time, the way snow accumulates, slowly, imperceptibly, one flake at a time, until the world is changed. On the 11th day, he smelled the forest. He was in the watch chamber, watching the road, when the wind shifted to the north, a wind that had been absent for days, replaced by a stillness so complete that the tower had seemed to exist in a pocket of suspended time. The north wind brought something with it. Not cold, exactly, though the cold was there. Something else. A smell. It was not a smell that he could identify easily. It was not smoke, not rot, not the smell of animals or of dead wood. It was something older. Something that seemed to belong to a place and a season that the world had passed through so long ago that no memory of it remained except in the smell itself, the smell of a world that had been cold for so long that the cold had become its defining characteristic, its deepest quality, its reason for being. Ewan stood at the northern arrow slit and breathed the smell. He tried to place it, to give it a name, to connect it to something in his experience. He could not. It was too large for his experience. It was too old. He thought about Corinne's journal entry from day 2847, the lights in the forest. He thought about the tracks that appeared and stopped at the edge of the road. He thought about the bell, and the symbol that Corinne had found on the table on day 4031. He thought about the 4033 days and the morning when Corinne had decided to walk north. He went to the ground floor and looked at the bell. It was silent. It was always silent when he looked at it. But he had come to understand that its silence was not the same as the silence of other objects. Other objects were silent because they had no capacity for sound. The bell was silent because it was waiting. He returned to the watch chamber. He watched the road. He made his notes. He did not record the smell. On the 18th day, the clay jug cracked. Ewan had been filling it from the snow, melting snow in a pot over the fire, then letting the water cool before pouring it into the jug. This was the system. It was not elegant, but it worked. Until the 18th day, when he filled the jug as usual and heard, from below, the sound of water falling on stone. He descended. A crack ran the full height of the jug, from lip to base, split open by the expansion of ice that had formed during the coldest night of the winter so far. The water had leaked onto the floor and formed a spreading dark pool that was already being absorbed by the stone, disappearing into the joints between the flagstones like ink into a blotter. Ewan looked at the crack. He thought about the jug's 11 years of service, the water it had held, the ice it had resisted, the cold it had endured without complaint until this single night when the resistance finally failed. He thought about Corinne filling this same jug, drinking from this same water, living this same daily routine of melting and filling and drinking and waiting for the next day to require the same action again. He did not replace the jug. There was nothing to replace it with. The village had sent him with supplies, food, clothing, fire-starting equipment, a spare knife, but they had not sent a spare jug. The jug was a thing of the tower. It belonged to the tower the way the bell belonged to the tower, the way the tally marks belonged to the slate, the way Corinne had belonged to the tower and had, in some essential way, never left. He set the cracked jug aside and used a ceramic bowl instead. The bowl was shallow and wide and the water evaporated quickly, but it served the purpose. He noted the crack in his journal, his own journal, the one he had started on his first day, recording the same kinds of observations Corinne had recorded, adding his own entry to the long record of time spent at the end of the road tower. The jug's crack was not significant in any practical way. But it was the first thing that had broken. And in a place where nothing changed, where the road stayed empty and the forest stayed silent and the bell stayed still, a break was an event. A crack was a small story. And Ewan had learned, by now, to attend to small stories, to notice the way they gathered in the margins of a life, accumulating quietly until the margins became the whole of the picture, and what had seemed like the background revealed itself as the subject all along. Ewan stood at the northern window on the 20th morning. The road stretched ahead, pale, narrow, marked with stones that the snow had not quite covered. It curved gently toward the forest and disappeared into the trees. Beyond the forest, the flat white horizon that continued without interruption, without variation, without anything to suggest that the world had ever changed or would ever change again. He thought about Corinne walking that road on day 4034. He thought about what it would have been like, the crunch of snow under boots, the cold pressing against exposed skin, the forest growing closer with each step until the trees rose on every side and the road became a tunnel of bare branches and frozen ground and absolute silence. He thought about the moment when Corinne would have reached the forest's edge, and the decision he would have faced, whether to enter, or to turn back, or to stand at the threshold and wait. Ewan had not yet decided whether to walk the road. He understood that the decision was not urgent. He had supplies for several more weeks. He had fire. He had the journal. He had the bell, though he did not yet understand its language. He had time, not unlimited, but enough. Enough to watch, to wait, to learn the rhythms of this place before making a choice that could not be unmade. But the road was calling him. Not in words, he heard no voices, saw no visions, experienced none of the dramatic phenomena that the old stories attributed to cursed places. The call was simpler than that. It was the call of a question that had been left unanswered. It was the weight of the silence, which was not empty at all but full of something that pressed against the boundaries of the known world, waiting for someone to come close enough to understand what it was. Ewan watched the road. He watched the forest. He watched the white silence that surrounded everything and gave nothing away. Then he descended to the ground floor, and he cooked his meal, and he read another chapter of Corin's journal, and he went to sleep on the cold straw mattress in the cold stone tower at the end of the road, and he did not dream of the road north. Or if he did not remember it in the morning. Ewan found the book on the 28th day. He was searching the ground floor for additional supplies, a methodical search that he should have conducted weeks ago but had until the dwindling of his food stores made the search necessary. The tower contained more than he had expected. A chest against the far wall, which he had assumed was empty or locked, proved to contain tools, a hatchet with a chipped blade, a coil of rope, a tin of grease that had solidified with age but might still be usable, a pair of leather gloves that were too large for his hands but would serve when handling cold metal. A shelf above the chest held jars of preserved food, dried fruit, salted fish, a small pot of something dark and dense that he recognized as a form of pemmican, made from rendered fat and dried meat and capable of sustaining a man through weeks of hard winter. The book was behind the jars. A slim volume, leather-bound, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The title on the cover was faded beyond reading, but the first page bore a handwritten inscription, *, to be kept at the tower for the instruction of future keepers. *. He opened it. The book was a record of the road, its construction, its purpose, its maintenance. It had been written by a man whose name was given in the frontispiece as the surveyor Olverath, though no other biographical information was provided. The text was formal, precise, written in the style of official documentation, the kind of writing used for records that were meant to outlast the people who made them. In the year 1142 of the Third Age, the surveyor Olverath was commissioned by the Council of the Northern Marches to survey and record the road that now extends from the settlement of Thornmouth north to the boundary stone at the forest's edge. The road was constructed over a period of 7 years by labour forces drawn from the garrison at Thornmouth and from the village settlements along the southern march. Its purpose, as stated in the commission, was the facilitation of trade and communication between the northern settlements and the market towns of the south. Ewan read on. The road had been built as a trade route, a way for the northern communities to exchange goods with the south, for furs and timber and iron ore to flow downward and for grain and tools and cloth to flow upward. The road had been maintained for perhaps 2 centuries, during which time a small but steady traffic had moved along it, merchants, messengers, settlers moving north to establish new communities in the forests and the plains beyond. But the traffic had declined. The book recorded this decline in careful, measured language, fewer entries each year, longer intervals between maintenance surveys, references to roads and bridges falling into disrepair. By the end of the record, the road was described as *little used*, and the final entry, dated approximately 40 years before Ewan's own arrival, noted that the road north of the watchtower is no longer maintained, and its condition should be considered impassable during winter months. Ewan closed the book. He sat at the table and thought about the road, its 7 years of construction, its 2 centuries of use, its slow abandonment, its present state of beautiful, terrible emptiness. The road had been built to carry people and goods between places that needed each other. It had been maintained because the connections it enabled were valuable. And then the connections had ceased to be valuable, all the places on the northern end had ceased to exist, all the people who used the road had found other ways to do what the road had enabled them to do, and the road had been left to the cold and the snow and the silence. The road had been built by people who believed that movement was necessary, that connection was good, that a path between 2 places was worth the labor of its creation. And now it stood at the end of the world, maintained by no one, remembered by no one, used by no one except a man in a tower who had been sent to watch it and who found, each day, that there was nothing to see. Ewan understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that the road was the story. Not the tower, not the keeper, not the bell. The road. The long, patient, purposeful road that had been built to connect things and that now connected nothing, that ended at a watchtower whose purpose no one could clearly state, that continued north into a forest from which nothing emerged and toward a horizon that promised nothing and revealed nothing. He placed the book on the shelf beside the jars. He would read it again. He would read it slowly, carefully, the way Corinne must have read it, searching for clues in the formal language, in the careful measurements, in the names of surveyors and laborers and officials who had believed that what they were building would last. The tracks were there on the 31st morning. Ewan was in the watch chamber, as he always was, when he noticed something different in the snow on the road. A set of prints, not the animal tracks he had grown accustomed to, but human prints. 2 feet, side by side, pressed deep into the snow with the weight of a man standing still. The prints faced north. They were not part of a larger track. There was no approach, no retreat, no line of footprints extending in either direction. They simply appeared, 2 impressions in the snow, as if someone had stood at that exact spot and waited. Ewan watched them for a long time. He did not descend. He did not go to examine them. He watched from above, the way he had learned to watch everything in this place, from a distance, with patience, without the expectation of resolution. The snow fell. The prints filled slowly, softened at their edges, began the slow process of disappearing into the general whiteness of the landscape. By midday, they were half gone. By evening, they were memory. But they had been there. Ewan had seen them. And they had told him something, not in words, not in any language he understood, but in the fact of their existence. Someone had stood at the end of the road, facing north, and had waited. Someone had been there, on the same ground where Ewan now stood, looking at the same forest, breathing the same cold air. Corinne? Possibly. But Corinne had walked north, not stood still. Corinne's prints, if Corinne had left prints, would have shown movement, a stride, a rhythm, the pattern of a man in motion. These prints were the pattern of stillness. Of waiting. Ewan descended to the ground floor. He lit the fire. He cooked his meal. He read the journal. He went to sleep. In the morning, the snow had covered everything. The tracks were gone. The road was empty. The tower stood at the end of the world, exactly as it had stood for 11 years, exactly as it would stand for 11 more, holding its silence like a man holds his breath, waiting for something to happen or for the waiting itself to become the story. On the 35th night, the bell rang. Ewan was in the sleeping quarters, lying on the straw mattress with his eyes half closed, drifting in that space between waking and sleep where the mind produces its most vivid images and its most free associating thoughts. He heard the first note as clearly as if someone had struck the bell with a hammer, a single, clear, resonant sound that rose through the stone walls of the tower and filled the room. He sat up. He listened. The second note came. Then the third. Then a pause, a silence that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, during which Ewan heard nothing but the faint movement of wind against the tower's upper walls. Then the fourth note. Then the fifth. A sequence. Not random. Not the arbitrary sound of a bell touched by wind or animal or the settling of the tower's timbers. A sequence, 5 notes, separated by intervals of equal length, repeated once, and then silence. Ewan climbed the ladder. He climbed it quickly, his hands finding the rungs with the automatic precision of a body that has climbed the same ladder every day for weeks, until the action has become instinct rather than choice. He reached the watch chamber and stood in the center and listened. The fire was banked, its coals barely visible, casting no light. The darkness of the watch chamber was total, a darkness without color or direction, the kind of darkness that makes you aware of the shape of your own skull and the weight of the air against your skin. Ewan stood in this darkness and listened to the silence that followed the bell's sequence. Then the sequence began again. 5 notes. Equal intervals. A pause. 5 notes. The same sequence, exactly as before, as if the bell were a voice and the sequence were words and the words were being spoken by something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Ewan did not move. He did not speak. He stood in the dark and listened to the bell and understood, with the same kind of understanding that had come to him when he had read Corin's journal, the understanding that was not explanation but recognition, the knowledge that some things were true not because they could be proved but because they could be felt. The sequence repeated 3 more times. Then it stopped. The silence returned, thicker and deeper than before, as if the bell had taken something from the room with it when it finished speaking. Ewan did not sleep that night. He sat in the watch chamber beside the banked fire and watched the darkness and listened to the silence, and in the morning he descended to the ground floor and opened Corin's journal and found, in the entries from the 4031st day, the day of the symbol, a note that he had not fully understood when he first read it. Asterisk the bell rang in a sequence today. 5 notes. I have heard it before, in dreams, and I wondered if the dreams were my own invention. But the sequence is not my invention. It is older than I am, older than the tower, perhaps older than the road itself. I do not know what it means. But I believe it is trying to tell me something. Asterisk. Ewan read the entry twice. He looked at the bell, hanging in its usual place, silent, patient, its surface furred with dust. He understood, now, that the bell was not random. It was not decorative. It was a voice, not a human voice, not any voice that belonged to a creature he could name, but a voice nonetheless. A voice that had been speaking at the end of the road tower for longer than anyone could remember, in a sequence of 5 notes that meant something to someone, even if that someone was not human and not present and not, in any sense that Ewan could define, alive. He touched the bell. It rang, a single note, dull and flat, the sound of metal against metal. Not the sequence. Just the one note, the way a word is not the same as a sentence. He let go. He descended to the ground floor. He ate his breakfast. He climbed back to the watch chamber. He watched the road. The world was exactly as it had been the day before and the day before that and every day since his arrival. But something had changed. Something in the quality of his attention, in the way he held the silence, in the weight of the question that the bell had asked and that he could not yet answer. The sequence had contained 5 notes. Perhaps each note was a chapter. Perhaps the sequence was a story, a message, an account of something that had happened at the end of the road long before Corin arrived and long before Ewan came and long before the road was built and the tower was raised and the bell was hung in its place in the beam. Perhaps the bell was saying, asterisk, I was here before you. I will be here after you. Listen, if you can. Try to understand. The road ends, but the story does not. Asterisk. Ewan decided to walk the road on the 42nd day. He did not decide lightly. He spent 2 days preparing, consolidating his supplies, organizing his clothing, checking the condition of his boots, Corin's boots, which had proven sturdy and warm and well suited to the work of this place. He wrote a final entry in his own journal, recording the date and the state of his provisions and the weather and the condition of the road. He described the bell and its sequence and the tracks that had appeared and disappeared and the smell at the edge of the forest and the cracked clay jug and the tally marks that covered Corin's slate, running to more than 800 days of solitary watch. He left the journal on the table beside Corin's journal. He left the two books side by side, the surveyor's record of the road's construction and purpose, and Corin's record of the daily life of a keeper who had spent 11 years watching a road that led nowhere. He left them for whoever might come next. For whoever might find them, in a tower at the end of the world, and wonder about the men who had kept watch there. He lit the fire one last time. He banked it carefully, using the technique the old forester had taught him, creating a bed of coals that might survive for days, that might keep the cold at bay until someone came to check on the tower or until the fuel ran out and the fire died and the tower returned to its full silence. He descended the ladder. He passed the bell. He paused and looked at it, not touching it, not disturbing the dust that covered its surface, simply acknowledging its presence and the role it had played in this place, the voice that had spoken in sequences of 5 notes, the sound that had been here before him and would be hereafter. He opened the door. The cold was extraordinary, the coldest he had ever experienced, a cold that seemed to enter the body through every exposed surface and move toward the center, toward the heart, toward the warm core of a human being that did not want to let go of its heat. He stepped outside. The snow was deep, firm, the kind of snow that would support weight if you moved carefully. The road stretched north, visible as a pale line against the white ground, its stones barely visible above the frost. He pulled his coat tight. He began to walk. The first hour was easy. The road held the memory of its original construction, flat, wide, its surface studded with stones that had been placed with the intention of lasting, of bearing the weight of carts and horses and the slow machinery of trade. Ewan walked north at a steady pace, his breath visible in the air, his boots crunching in the frost. The second hour was harder. The road narrowed. The stones became fewer, more scattered, harder to follow. The fields on either side rose and fell with the contours of the land, their white surfaces unmarked by any path or track. The forest was closer now, he could see the individual trees, their bare branches like lines on a map, converging above him toward a point that seemed to recede as he walked. The third hour, he reached the edge of the forest. The trees stood in a wall, oak and ash and something darker that he could not identify, their trunks dark against the snow, their branches bare and intricate and endlessly varied. The road entered the forest and disappeared between the trees, and the quality of the light changed immediately, becoming the flat, diffused light of a place where the sky was hidden by canopy and the sun was a rumor rather than a fact. Ewan stopped. He stood at the edge of the forest and looked north, into the darkness between the trees, where the road continued as a pale line of frost and stone, winding between the trunks, climbing a gentle rise, disappearing around a bend that he could not see beyond. He thought about turning back. He thought about the fire in the watch chamber, banked and waiting. He thought about the bell and its sequence of 5 notes. He thought about Corin, who had walked this same road 42 days ago and had not returned, and he wondered if Corin had stood at this same spot, at this same edge, and made the same calculation, the calculation that is the central mathematics of any journey into the unknown. How much of myself am I willing to leave behind, and how much of the unknown am I willing to bring home? He took another step. Then another. He entered the forest. The road beneath his feet was harder to follow here. The stones were scattered and partially covered by snow, and in some places the road seemed to have been taken over by the forest entirely, roots crossing its surface, saplings growing in its wheel ruts, the slow green patient reclamation that occurs when human beings stop maintaining what they have built. Ewan followed the pale line as best he could, trusting it to lead him where it had always intended to go, trusting the men who had built it to have laid it true. He walked for another hour. The forest closed around him. The light faded. The cold deepened. And then, ahead, something that was not the road, not the forest, not the white nothing of the winter landscape. A light! Low to the ground. The color of a candle seen through glass. Ewan stopped. He watched. The light did not move. It stood among the trees, flickering very slightly, as if disturbed by a breath of wind that Ewan could not feel. He stood and watched it, and he thought about Corin's journal entry from day 2847, I saw the lights last night. In the forest. 3 lights, low to the ground, the color of a candle seen through glass. There was 1 light now. Not 3. But it was here, at the end of the road, exactly where Corin had described, exactly where the road led if you followed it far enough into the forest and the cold and the silence. Ewan walked toward the light. He did not hurry. He did not run. He walked at the pace that the snow and the cold and the narrowing road allowed, and with each step the light became slightly clearer, slightly larger, slightly more like a thing that could be understood. It was not moving. It was not fading. It was simply there, waiting, the way the bell had waited, the way the tower had waited, the way the road had waited for centuries for someone to walk its length and find what lay at its end. He was 20 paces from the light when he stopped. He could see it clearly now. It was not a candle. It was not a torch. It was not any source of light that he could name or describe. It was a column of something, not fire, not light, not smoke, but something that occupied the space between those things, that partook of their qualities without being any one of them. It rose from the frozen ground to a height of perhaps a man's height, and it flickered with a light that was not quite light, a light that illuminated nothing, that cast no shadow, that existed only for the person standing before it and vanished the moment you looked away. Ewan stood before it. He did not know what it was. He did not touch it. He did not speak. He simply stood, and watched, and understood that he had reached the end of the road, not the geographical end, not the point where the stones ran out and the forest began, but the other end, the inner end, the place where the road led not to a location but to a recognition. The recognition that he had been walking toward this light since the moment he had decided to come to the tower. That Corin had walked toward it on day 4034. That everyone who had ever stood at the end of the road and looked north had been walking toward this same light, this same column of not quite light that stood in the forest and waited and remembered. The light flickered. The cold pressed in. The forest held its silence. Ewan stood at the end of the road, at the edge of the light, at the place where the story stopped being about a tower and a keeper and a road and became about something else, something that had no name, that required no understanding, that simply was, the way the cold was, the way the snow was, the way the bell's sequence of 5 notes was, a voice speaking into a silence that had been listening for centuries. He did not go further. He did not touch the light. He turned and walked back along the road he had followed, through the forest, past the trees, into the open fields where the sky was wide and the snow was bright and the tower stood at the end of the road, waiting for him to return. Ewan reached the tower in the late afternoon. The fire had survived. He climbed to the watch chamber and found the coals still glowing, still warm, still maintaining the line of heat that separated life from cold. He added wood. He stood at the window and watched the road he had walked, the road that led north into the forest, the road that ended not at a destination but at a light that was not a light and a silence that was not empty. He descended. He ate. He opened Corin's journal to the final entry, *day 4033. I have decided to walk the road beyond the tower. He wrote beneath it, in his own hand, *day 42. I walked the road. I found what was there. I have returned. Then he closed the journal and placed it beside his own, and he climbed to the watch chamber, and he watched the road, and he waited. The bell did not ring that night. The silence was complete, the deep, mineral silence of a winter that had been cold for so long that it had become the natural state of everything, the background against which all other sounds were measured, the baseline from which no deviation was expected or required. Ewan lay beside the fire and listened to the silence, and he thought about the light in the forest, the column of not quite light that stood at the end of the road, flickering gently, remembering. He thought about Corin, who had walked the road and not returned, and he wondered if Corin had found the light and decided to stay with it, to join it, to become part of the thing that waited at the end of every road that led north. He wondered if that was what the light was, not a phenomenon but a gathering, a collection of everyone who had ever walked the road and found what lay at its end and chosen, in the way that you choose a final thing, to stay. He did not know. He would never know. The light had not answered his questions because the light was not in the business of answering questions. It was in the business of being, of standing at the end of the road and representing, in its flickering not quite light, the thing that all roads eventually lead to, the destination that no map can show, the end that is not an ending but a threshold, a place where the known world stops and the rest begins. Ewan slept. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of a man who has walked far and found something and returned and does not need to understand what he found in order to be grateful for it. In the morning, the snow was falling, soft, steady, the kind of snow that covers everything without disturbing anything, that creates a world of absolute quiet and absolute uniformity, a world in which the road and the fields and the forest are all the same color and the same texture and the same temperature, a world that asks nothing of you except that you stay where you are and let it be what it is. Ewan rose. He lit the fire. He climbed to the watch chamber. He looked north, toward the forest, toward the place where the road disappeared between the trees, toward the light that was not a light but a threshold. The light was not visible from the tower. It was too far. It was hidden by the forest and the distance and the snow. But he knew it was there. He had seen it. He had stood before it. He had turned away from it and walked back to the tower and climbed to the watch chamber and taken up his watch again, because that was what the tower asked of anyone who came to it, not that they go to the light, but that they return from the light and continue to watch, continue to record, continue to be present at the end of the road where the world expects someone to be present, even if the world has forgotten why. The bell rang. One note. Then a pause. Then another note. Then a pause. Ewan listened. The sequence was not the 5-note sequence he had heard on the 35th night. This was something else, 2 notes, alternating, a simple pattern, almost like a heartbeat, almost like a breath, the sound of something that was alive and patient and had been waiting for a very long time. He let the sound settle into the silence of the tower. He let it become part of the background, the cold, the stone, the fire, the road, the snow, the light beyond the forest, and now the bell, 2 notes, over and over, like a conversation that had no need for words because the words had already been said, centuries ago, in a language that no one remembered but that everyone still recognized. Ewan watched the road. The snow fell. The bell breathed its 2-note sequence into the cold stone room. And at the end of the road, the world held its silence and waited, as it always waited, for morning, for someone to come, for the story to continue in whatever direction it chose. Tonight, the story had chosen to rest. Ewan sat at the table in the ground floor, the fire burning low beside him, and counted Corin's possessions. There was the slate with its 800 tallies. There was the journal. There was the surveyor's book. There were the bowls on the shelf, 3 of them, each one slightly different from the others, the way handmade things always differ, each one having its own character, its own history of chips and cracks, and the particular way it held warmth when filled with soup on a winter's night. There was the coat on the hook by the door, the coat that had hung there since Corin's arrival, that had been worn and worn again until the wool had become soft as skin, until the color had faded to the gray of old stones, until the coat had become less a garment and more an impression, a shape that a body had left in cloth over the course of 11 winters. And there was the button. Ewan found it in the chest on the 2nd floor, in the box with the needles and thread. A single bone button, round, worn smooth on one side where it had been held and fastened and unfastened thousands of times over. The button had no pair. It had belonged to a garment that had worn out, a garment that had been patched and repatched and eventually replaced, but the button had been kept, saved, perhaps, for no particular reason, or for the reason that all kept things are saved, because it had been touched so many times that it had taken on some quality of the person who touched it, had become a small, dense record of a human hand and its daily work. Ewan held the button in his palm. It was warm from his own body heat, nothing more. It held no warmth of its own, had no capacity to generate heat, could not protect him from the cold that pressed against the tower's walls. But it was here. It had survived. It would survive him, if he left it here, if he placed it back in the box and closed the lid and descended the ladder and returned to the watch chamber and continued his watch until the day when someone else came to take his place. The button would be here. Small, round, smooth, unremarkable. A thing that remembered hands. Ewan had thought about the bell every day since his arrival. He had thought about it more since the night it rang in its 5-note sequence, and he had thought about it most since the morning he returned from the forest and found the tower exactly as he had left it, fire banked, door closed, cold and still and patient. He had thought about the bell in the context of everything else he had learned about this place, the road built for trade, the tower built for watching, the keepers who came and stayed and left their marks on slates and journals and coats and buttons. The bell had been here longer than any of them. It had been here before the tower was built. He understood this now, understood it in the way you understand a thing that is present in a story before the story begins, that has its own existence independent of the narrative that surrounds it. The surveyor's book made no mention of the bell. The commission for the tower's construction had specified a watch chamber, a ladder, a fire pit, storage for wood and food, sleeping quarters, all the practical elements of a functional outpost. The bell was not functional. It served no practical purpose. A keeper did not need a bell to watch a road. A signal could be sent by fire, not by iron and dust and the memory of a sound that was older than the tower itself. And yet the bell was here. Hanging from a peg in a beam, at the exact center of the ground floor, where every keeper who had ever climbed the ladder from above or descended from the watch chamber would pass it, would see it, would be reminded that there was something in this tower that was not accounted for in the official specifications, something that had been added, by who? By what? And that had remained, century after century, doing its work, speaking in sequences of 5 notes, waiting for someone to understand. Ewan did not understand. He did not believe that understanding was possible, not in the way that understanding a tool or a technique was possible, not in the sense of knowing how something worked and being able to operate it. The bell was not a tool. It was not a mechanism. it was something else, something that belonged to the category of objects that includes old houses and ancient roads and forests that have been standing since before anyone can remember. Objects that have their own kind of intention, their own kind of patience, their own kind of language. The bell was a language. 5 notes. A sequence. Perhaps a name. Perhaps an address. Perhaps a question that had been asked so long ago that the answer had been forgotten and the question itself had become the answer, had become the entire content of the bell's speech, repeated over and over across the centuries. Asterisk, are you still there? Are you still there? Are you still there? Asterisk. Ewan climbed to the watch chamber. He lit the fire. He watched the road. The bell, below him, was silent. The snow, outside, was falling. And at the end of the road, in the forest, the light that was not a light was still there, still waiting, still flickering with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. Ewan wrote his final entry on the 50th day. Asterisk day 50. The fire is steady. The road is empty. The forest holds its silence. The bell has not spoken since the night of the 2-note sequence. I have watched the road north and I have seen the light and I have returned and I do not know what the light means. I do not believe that meaning is the point. The light is. It exists at the end of the road. It has always existed at the end of the road. It will continue to exist after I leave, after the tower falls, after the road is buried under snow and the forest reclaims the ground on which it was built. The light does not need to be understood. It needs only to be witnessed. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have witnessed it. Asterisk. Asterisk, Corin walked the road and did not return, and I believe he found what he was looking for, not a destination but a confirmation, the confirmation that the road was real and led somewhere and that somewhere was not a place but a state, a condition, a way of being that the world offers to those who walk far enough and watch long enough and are willing to stand at the end of the road and let the cold and the silence and the light do their work on them. Asterisk. Asterisk, I will stay until the spring. I will watch the road. I will tend the fire. I will listen to the bell. And when the thaw comes, I will walk south, back to the village, back to the world of people and noise and purpose, and I will carry the road with me, the way you carry a scar or a memory, as evidence of something that happened to you that cannot be undone or explained. Asterisk. Asterisk, the tower will remain. The bell will remain. The road will remain. The light at the end of it will remain. And one day, another keeper will come, someone whose name I will not know, whose history I will not learn, and they will stand in this same room and look at the same slate and read the same journal and hear the bell ring its 5-note sequence, and they will wonder, as I have wondered, what it all means. Asterisk. Asterisk, the answer is in the wondering. The road teaches this. The tower teaches this. The snow teaches this. The cold, the silence, the light, all of them teaching the same lesson, which is that some things are not for knowing but for carrying, not for understanding but for being present. Asterisk. Asterisk, I am present. I have been present. I will remain present. Asterisk. Asterisk, this is the watchman's duty. Not to guard against something, but to remain. To be here. To be the one who stayed. Asterisk. Ewan set down the pen. He closed the journal. He sat in the silence of the ground floor and listened to the fire and the wind and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of snow falling on snow, the soft, continuous, unhurried percussion of a world in the act of covering itself, of making itself new, of erasing its own history in preparation for whatever comes next. He did not go to the watch chamber. He did not look at the road. He simply sat, and listened, and let the tower be what it was, a place at the end of the world, where someone had chosen to stay, where the cold was deep and the silence was old and the bell waited patiently for the next voice to answer its question. The snow fell. The fire burned. The road ran north. And at the end of the road, the light continued its long, slow vigil, not guiding, not warning, not illuminating anything beyond itself. Simply there. Simply waiting. Simply the place where the known world stopped and the rest began.